Law is a many-faceted concept, but one of the core ideas behind law as we structure it currently is that there exists a structure of continuity which can be accepted, altered, and carried on through time. What do I mean by this? Well, we as subjects inherit the law and legal structure from our predecessors, change what we think ought to be changed throughout our lifetimes, and pass on the result to those that follow. Implicit in this process is that we leave the state of the law, and by extension the situation of the country that it is tied to, in a better state than when we found it. Ours is only a custodian role, not an ownership. The "we" in question refers primarily to the lawmakers, the sovereign entity, and the electing body if applicable primarily, but to the population at large as well. In the ever-present consideration that it is not their right to destroy or gamble their inheritance on a transient whim. Although it has happened, of course, this is no less egregious than a titled nobleman who, upon the death of his father from whom he gains his title and estate, gambles it all away on a single hand of cards or a spin of the roulette wheel. All systems which acknowledge only the present generation of custodians at the expense of the past and future generations is a perverse celebration of presence in the current moment. If we were to observe such in the present alone, we would rightly consider it unjust. Say if a group of people were to be divided arbitrarily into 3 rooms, and then one at random were to be selected which could make unrestricted decisions regarding the situation of all 3. There would rightly be outrage. Now if the decisions were limited in some capacity, that would be a slight improvement. This is part of the conceptual basis behind an entrenched constitution. Taking the concept a step further, if all electoral majorities must be qualified, as is generally the case with constitutional changes, then some spur-of-the-moment decision by the incumbent generation cannot change the entire structure of the country. Further still, perhaps, if all changes made over the course of a set period must be re-evaluated somewhere down the line, then a change cannot be snuck through which is then set in stone, as was roughly the case in Sparta. A further protection to the future and past generations. Or perhaps, as the name of the piece suggests, the interests of the groups be weighed not according to how many of them there are physically present and able to participate, but according to their actual relevance. By the time it enters the modern popular imagination, the Estates General of the Ancien Regime is quite quaint, but some of the underlying wisdom is more relevant than ever. It need not be in the same fashion of creating 3 representative bodies, but some method of ensuring that all 3 of these concerns are heard as necessary. Particularly in a moral sense, as we in some sense subsist off the benefits of the institutional framework granted to us by prior generations, and yet spit on their legacy with the invention and carrying through of new moral codes to judge them by, as well as the system they built. Meanwhile, we leverage the earnings of future generations to gain favourable interest rates on loans, and then often use that money to spend on ourselves and our own conscience. Neither of these groups truly have a substantial voice on these matters, and so they may be ignored and exploited at will. And so I propose that we think of the body of the nation be considered in 3 blocks. The first estate, which consists of all previous generations, and perhaps even those who are still living, but largely outside of the mainstream society by this point. The second estate, which is currently living and working members, typically what we would currently consider the demos or electorate. And the third estate, which is all those who are unborn or yet to truly enter society. And while none of these groups are totally infallible by definition, the exploitation of any for the benefit of the others ought to be unconscionable. However, on the topic of practically protecting these interests I am less sure. Clearly our forebearers were and are not infallible, but to assume that we know better simply because we are alive and they are not is the height of hubris. Worse still, that we could be emotionally driven to undermine the whole structure or subverted into doing so is an enormous disservice to all 3. So specifically, what does this take off the table? It limits the extent to which we may make changes, for we are only to tweak the system as reality deems necessary, not remake, totally repurpose, or redesign the whole structure. This is our duty primarily to the first estate, but so too to carry the will of the first to the third. Similarly, our duty to the third is first and foremost to ensure that they can exist in peace and safety, inasmuch as we ourselves have. Likewise, that they may receive the same standard of living, or better. And beyond that they may receive their inheritance bequeathed to them from the first, and live as they intended. The implications here are, of course, not so obvious, as I have no immediate prescriptions for how to redress this imbalance of influence. But it will be a consideration going forward.